For every massive music trend that comes up, you have the iconic leaders who lead the pack critically and commercially. Poor imitators who try to latch on to the bandwagon and succeed to varying degrees. Then you have artists who sit in between those two extremes. For every Blink-182 in the pop-punk sphere, you had a band like Good Charlotte or Simple Plan following along. And while Nirvana and Pearl Jam may have been on top of the grunge world, they had folks like Hole and Bush who had their own set of fans standing behind them. These artists may not be the best of what that trend has to offer, but it's this middle class of quality that plays a huge role in translating a trend to mainstream success. The 2000s saw indie rock blow up in the streets of Brooklyn and the suburban homes of teenagers who watched the OC. Pop music definitely poached off indie trends throughout the 2000s, but the 2010s marked a turning point in indie music's willingness to take these pop aspirations into their own hands. Foster the People was one of those bands who turned indie inclinations into a new pop palette that was as indebted to LCD Soundsystem as it was to Top 40 radio. Torches, the band's debut, dropped 10 years ago, and it latched onto a wave of pop-inspired indie music that was quickly making its way around the scene and leaving its mark. Torches dropped about a year after Pumped Up Kicks, a slow-burning sleeper hit that went from the output of a few hours in Logic Pro into one of the definitive songs of summer 2011. The full-length record helped the band dominate the summer of 2011 in a way that was hard to forget over the course of the decade. Foster the People captured an emerging 2010s sound that would become ubiquitous throughout the decade. The band emerged as leaders of the middle class of this pop-leaning revolution that had started to define alternative and indie music. Mark Foster grew up in Ohio and moved to Los Angeles when he turned 18 in 2002. He spent most of his 20s working as a bartender, painter, telemarketer, and just floating around odd jobs for a couple of years while trying to make it as a musician. It was also during these years that he struggled with addiction, which he eventually ended up rehabbing from. Foster formed his own band in 2009, naming themselves Foster the People. Early in the band's tenure, Mark Foster spent a couple of hours writing and recording a song that would eventually become Pumped Up Kicks. The song itself would drop the next year in 2010, and it quickly gained momentum around the internet and alternative circles. Eventually, the band landed on Columbia Records, who released the band's debut, Torches, in May of 2011. The record secured Foster the People's place in the early 2010s alternative narrative, ushering in the genre's transition from serious and artful into mainstream by design. The band did this by latching on to the emerging sounds of the decade to capture a pop sound of the future. Bands like Phoenix, MGMT, and Passion Pit became dominant names in the alternative world throughout 2008 and 2009. These bands recognized that indie music could be fun, catchy, and accessible by design. This pop inclination wasn't the goal of the contemporary genre icons like Grizzly Bear and The National, whose work was far more indebted to indie music's more artful inclinations. I was someone who was online in the late 2000s and early 2010s and also listened to a good amount of alternative radio. And these bands managed to gain so much traction on both fronts that their success really seemed inevitable.
It was this movement that led to songs like Kids, Midnight City, Take a Walk, Anna Sun, and more to become defining radio and internet hits of the 2010s. Torches tailored itself to this emerging tradition, leading into the mainstream appetite for under-the-radar music that sounded like amped-up pop music.
But it was Foster the People who became one of the first major bands to prove that fun, indie music could actually translate to top 40 success and wasn't just limited to this niche alternative sphere. As for Mark Foster, he had a pretty good knack for writing catchy songs that could capture a diverse array of influences. He actually said that early in his career, he struggled because he was an eclectic songwriter who didn't really know how to hone in the right approach to his sound, just because he had so many different ideas. He said in an interview that he had songs written that were hip-hop tracks, electronic songs, spirituals, and just classic piano tracks. A real range of songs that show off someone's talent, but make it difficult to hone in on something, especially when trying to blow up at a commercial level. And this challenge seems a little bit weird when artists seem to go out of their way to combine disparate sounds and influences for the streaming age. But 10 years ago, indie music was a lot more niche and had a landscape that was more focused on blogs and picky listeners rather than current listeners who can just pop on any song and be able to latch onto different sounds really quickly almost at the snap of a finger. Ultimately, the band took from what would become a really common playbook in the streaming era and really took stock of emerging sounds around them, finding ways to try all of these different sounds out instead of fully committing to one sonic landscape throughout Torches. Singles like Houdini and Call It What You Want were straightforward alternative dance tunes with thumping rhythmic sections and arpeggiated instrumental melodies that see the song ascend and descend with their danceable grooves. A track like Waste is a vaguely psychedelic electropop bop that grooves slowly into a bridge that feels like it was taken straight out of MGMT's Oracular Spectacular. It has a haunted house sing-song that plays off the church bells that ring throughout the song. Don't Stop, Color on the Walls is a campy power pop guitar romp with high-pitched whistles and a whiny chorus that would feel right at home on a Dandy Warhols record. And it still manages to find a home on Torches, which oscillates between the darker sounds of Waste and Life on the Nickel and the more danceable tracks like Helena Beat and Houdini. Foster the People threw so many different ideas at the wall. In some cases, they took different ideas and put them side by side in different tracks, but in other cases, they just merged different ideas together to create something that sounded really unique, especially to the mainstream listener who may not have been exposed to a band like Passion Pit or Phoenix ahead of time. Now, I wouldn't say that Torches was one of the best records of this era or the decade by a long shot, nor would I really say that Foster the People emerged as one of the dominant indie bands of the decade. But the success that the band had on Torches was a bellwether for where this music would go over the course of the decade. Torches ended up epitomizing a few parallel threads in indie and alternative music that boiled down to the same thing. Indie and alternative music became much more willing to lean into pop influences during the 2010s. And at the same time, this music, at least by 21st century definitions, became more ingrained within the larger pop culture sphere. The easiest line to draw between Foster the People and the rest of the alternative music sphere came in its influence on that chippy, danceable indie band sound that major labels threw a lot of weight behind early in the decade. Bands like Walk the Moon, Fun, and Group Love had enough support from indie circles to get small doses of success in that realm. But then they went down the path of top 40 aspirations. This meant going out for big singles, trying to get those placements in Microsoft commercials, and really trying to cement their place in the grocery store standards of the next 20 to 30 years.
Imagine Dragons is probably the best example of this phenomenon. They were marketed early in their career as an alternative band with a pop edge, ready to fill up arenas and stadiums in a way that few other rock bands could. And nowadays they're doing exactly that, but with a sound that's completely distant from anything close to the indie alternative tradition. That's not meant as like a good or bad thing, that's just meant as a description. At this point, they're making songs meant for commercials, meant for stadiums, and meant for people above the age of 50 to enjoy at the gym, which is totally fine. They seem to be doing really well on that front, which is good to see.
And a lot of indie circles will give a lot of crap to some of these more pop-oriented indie bands like Imagine Dragons and Foster the People, but it's not like the highbrow artists weren't doing it either. If anything, the highbrow indie sphere leaned hard into this pop orientation and became super willing to indulge these poppy inclinations throughout the decade. HAIM and CHVRCHES emerged as new bands who were dropping melodic bangers, but then Arcade Fire was a legacy act who joined the other two and many others in this more sophisticated scene to create songs that were underground enough to keep the indie kids and the hipsters happy, while being just popular enough that those same indie kids could get really mad that The Mother We Share or The Wire wasn't dominating top 40 radio, because it felt like those bands were just on the precipice of it. And ultimately we reached the point where a band like CHVRCHES could just release straight up pop songs, but they only managed to hit with that underground indie audience, the same highbrow people who spent much of the decade coming around to pop influences making their way into indie music. Foster the People was smart enough to capture this wave on the front end and created a record that had under the radar inspirations and top 40 aspirations.
Torches succeeded because it took enough from the indie and alternative playbook to be dangerous, but really pushed itself as a top 40 mainstream record. The album ended up selling 2 million copies in the United States, going 2 times platinum. and the song Pumped Up Kicks became a touchstone for indie culture in the United States because of how it became one of the only indie songs to actually do really well on the Billboard Hot 100. The other bands who did this, Fun and Gautier, their songs took pop influences just as seriously as Torches did. Both of those bands, along with Foster the People, latched on to the nebulous label of indie and spun it around into a top 40 hit. Kids and Midnight City may have meant more to the 2010s alternative story at the much larger scale, but Foster the People played a major role as part of the middle class in making this alternative story one worth telling, one that actually mattered at the mainstream level, and not just some pick out of the alternative indie sphere that had been around for so many years before Torches dropped. Torches was a major label project that looked to succeed by taking indie influences and spinning them around into top 40 tracks. And call it what you want, but I do think that Foster the People really cemented their place in the 2010s alternative story through this record and what it meant to the scene moving forward. Thank you so much for watching to the end here. I appreciate you listening to what I had to say about Foster the People. If you like what I had to say here, check out my other takes on the channel and stay tuned for the next one. It'll be up here at some point soon. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to talk to y'all soon.